Okay, so in today's video, I'm going to try and recreate this landscape as close as I can. I'm not going to be 100% accurate, but it's just a bit of inspiration to draw on. And I've broken down this image in a certain way. I've gone from the furthest element up to the closest element. So if I switch this back on, I have 1, 2. I've broken this one into like 3.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 because it kind of has a bit of variation in it. And then the road here is 8 and 7 and so on in the two single trees and a bit of foliage here with some stones. Now the reason I've broken it up in this way is so we can tackle this image piece by piece. It's going to be too difficult if you're going to be jumping in between bit by bit. We're going to go through the motions and we're going to go get this road done, then get this part done, instead of going from like this to this and this and not knowing when to start. Another thing we need to do is we don't really have measurement on this. We could use perspective tools and camera match and 3ds Max, but we don't really have any proper measurement to use in those tools. So what I've done is if I unselect this and select this layer on, what I've done is I think the distance between these two is between 2 and 2.5 meters. So then I've tried to calculate with little x's, I'm not sure how easy it is to see, the gaps in between. So I've counted them all up, and at this major point I've calculated it's around 20 or 22.5 at this section. Then up to here it's about 42.5, and then up to here is plus 20 meters, which is probably about 62.5. So now that we know the distances vaguely, or educated guesses, we can then build this model in 3ds Max. So let's jump into Max and get started with this scene. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a camera. Go into create, go into cameras and select V-Ray and V-Ray physical camera. Click and drag this on, right click, and then what I'm going to do is select all of it and I'm just going to put it to 0 on the grid. Select the target and just bring this up a bit. Let's go a bit further and that should be fine. Now in the shot itself, usually the average height of a person would be between 1.6 and 1.8, and in that shot it's someone standing taking the photo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these, and on the Z I'm going to put it around 1.65. We're about to be holding the camera to take the picture around eye level. We could go a bit higher, but we don't know the size of the person, so we're just going to guess. So next thing to do is if I go into here and hit C to go into our camera, and then I'm going to hit Alt B and I'm going to load in our image. So go into our images, our references, and load this in, apply to active view, and there we have our image. Now it's important in your render settings that you have this set to the size of your image. If you don't, then you're going to have some weird, sorry, this is locked. If you don't, you're going to have some stretching. So that was 745, I believe, and there we have the correct size. And that's the start of our scene. Now we're going to start creating the road. Okay, so now let's create our road. I've loaded in one different image, but basically it just has the measurements so I don't have to flick back and forth. So around here we have 22.5, 42.5 and 60.5 all the way up here. We can extend it even further. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a line. I'm going to make sure my snaps is set to grid point. And I'm going to turn on snaps by hitting S or clicking the button up here. Then I'm going to click once and then I'm going to deselect S. So now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move up here and click once. And then for this corner, then I'm going to hold down shift and click another time for that point, and then finally another shift click for the end point. Now obviously this isn't correct at the moment, but what we need to do is this first one down here is, at the moment it's set to like around 14 meters. We want this to be 22.5. Then we want this to be 42.5. And this one to be, let's go 65 for this one. And that'll be our endpoint. Now we have the distance, so now we don't need to move it in the Y anymore, but we do need to move it in the X and in the Z axis too. So let's go back to our top view and we'll pick the very first point and we're going to move this to where we need it to be. So roughly in the middle of the grass, and then we need to move this down and we have that point exactly over here where we need. We're going to do the same for this one. Again, move it in the X. I'm going to move it around here. I'm going to go for around this point up here. So we need to move it up in the Z. And we have that point around here. And then this one needs to go over around here. So we need to move it in the X over. And then we need to move it in the Z. So it's up around here. And that's basically the main points we have. Now what we need to do is we need to select each of these vertices, change it to say a Bezier corner, and then these ones I want to change to Bezier. So once that's done, we can start moving these points where we need it to be. So I'm going to select this one and start moving this until it makes a bit more sense to turn to the road. So move it slightly there. Then this one I'm going to move like here, but again we don't want it too strong because you can see it's bending that road. So then we're going to move this point to where it should be firstly, so that should be more into the middle, about here I would say, and then we can select this point again and just start moving it. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add in another point here, because now that we have these 2 points, they'll control that. So I'm going to hit refine down here and add another point here so we get a bit more control. So I'm going to start moving this along here like so, bend the path a bit more, and we don't have to be super accurate. Again, we're not creating this image to 100% exactly the same. We just want something roughly the same. Now that's a bit too strong here, so we can pull that in, and we're starting to get that road. So it dips down, it goes up, but as you can see here we have a straight line here. So again I'm going to hit refine, and I'm going to add a point somewhere around here, grab this point, and what we'll do is we'll move this up and down like that, so we get a bit more of a slope. Maybe I'll make that a bit more gradual, something like that. So now we have the slope coming down, we have it looping, and we have to go outside. And this part is really important because it pretty much defines our road, our surfaces, and everything we can build off just a simple spline. So let's jump into creating the sweep modifier and the texture needed for this surface. So now that I have the spline done, we now need to create the road surface. And the best way to do this, or I find a very good way to do it, is to add a sweep modifier. Now the one thing I've changed is in interpolation, I've changed this to not optimize and changed this to 25. So when I hit sweep, we're going to get a lot of detail. But say if I was to go back here and I switch this to show the end result, if you bring this down say to 10, you'll get less detail if you want that. So 25 might be a bit much, we can just do 20 and that should be fine. And then if we go back up the sweep, there's a few things I want to change. So I want this to be at the top. So I want this, so basically that's where the pivot begins. So the middle, the bottom, the top center is what I want. And make sure that banking is unchecked. So at the moment it stays pretty much flat along that, but if you have banking, it's going to start rotating and banking like it says up that spline, but I don't want that. I want it to stay pretty flat. And I also make sure you have generate mapping coordinates and real world size and all those settings. Now obviously we don't want the road to be that big, and if I go into my other view, you'll see that maybe it's a bit too wide. So first of all, let's change the length. I want it to be like 0.1, so that's 10 centimeters. So when setting the thickness, what I want to do is I want to get just that inside, because we want to get the main road, and this is going to be covered up by grass and planting anyway, so we don't need to worry too much about that. So it looks about 3.8 is a good one. Maybe 3.5 is better. 3 meters, bit too little. So let's go 3.5, and that seems to give us a good bit of thickness. So I'm now going to use a texture to build this road, and this is a great texture which is brought in from Polygon, I believe is the texture I got it, and you can see we're going to get a great material from this. So how do we apply it? So let's load it into 3ds Max. So here I have the images. I'm going to load them all in, and I'm using a plugin called Material Texture Loader, and it automatically loads it in based on the name. So Road Dirt, I'm going to do the version 1. Everything else looks good. I want to change this to real world, and this isn't uniform. If I go to my image, you'll see that the image is 6 by 3. So let's do that. For the moment, we will change it. So this would be 6 by 3, and it could be the other way, to be honest. I never really know. So that seems good enough for now. V-Ray, blur down to 0. We have the displacement, which I do want to use. I'm going to click Create Material and name it. Seems like my neighbor upstairs is banging on the walls for some reason. Okay, and then we're just going to apply this to our road base. Click Displace, and I probably don't want 20 centimeters. 0.15 should be fine for now, and hit Apply to select it. So another thing we want to do is, under this sweep, I'm going to add an Edit Poly. And I don't want this thickness. I just want one plane. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the polygon, It'd be a bit easier maybe if I go full screen. I'm going to select here to here, hit delete, and the bottom one I'm also going to delete. Now the great thing about that sweep modifier, you can see here that it follows that spline now, so we don't have to create UVs and it's perfectly matched. But let's see what it looks like inside the render. But just before that, we need to add in some lighting, so I'm going to add in HDRI image. So go into your Cosmos browser, or I assume you have it with V-Ray. I think I had day 29 is one of the ones I used lately. This one here, yeah. So export into my scene, and that would automatically create a V-Ray light, which is our dome light. In our settings, I can select our camera. And we're going to change a few things here. So since it's outdoor, I'm going to do a 16 f-stop and maybe go a bit brighter for 100. And let's see what that looks like. So the render's done a pretty good job. You can see this texture is really good and really powerful, but it's a bit too wide. This is actually the center. So let's fix that now. So there's two ways you can change this. You can add in a UVX form, but I'm going to do it in the material itself. So once you're into the material, let's change a few settings. So if I go in here, and you can see the render here, I want to change probably the height, which you think it's the other one, but I think it's the height. So let's change this to something like 12. And that's gone too far. So let's go 3 meters. And there we go. So it's a bit less. Now we're overlapping here again, so that's a bit too much. So we can go to 4 meters maybe, 3.5. And there we go. Now we get a pretty good look. Now we can see it's repetitive a bit too much down the center here. So that's where we can increase this to something like 12. And there we go. Now it looks a bit like it's stretching, but I think it's going to be okay. I think that texture works really well. And the displacement itself is giving us a great look. And that's going to be perfect because we're also going to be covering up this edge with grass and everything. And that's pretty much our road done. Now we'll be moving on to adding planting along the edge of this using this exact same spline that we already have. Okay, so now we need to create the grass on the edge here, but if I hide this for the moment, you'll see that there's some well-kept landscape grass over here, and then it gets a bit rough on the edge, so we need to create both. But the very first thing we need to do is we need to create a surface for this entire base ground level. So in order to do that, what I'm quickly going to do is I'm going to create a rough surface that we can always alter later, but I just need something to work with now. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to call this f_surface_main. And the reason I named it that is because this goes into my Forest Pro layer and it goes into my surfaces. So that's just the naming convention that I have. I don't need a displacement. I also want to remove the materials by going to this utility. You'll find it in here if you don't have it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to edge, select all the edges, actually going to go border. So it selects all the edges, and then I'm going to go to create shape, and I'm just going to keep it like that for the moment, no name. And then what I want to do is we have this shape like this, but what I want to do is I want to go to segments, and I'm going to grab all these, select all, go to spline, and then go to outline, and I'm going to start off with something kind of small, something like this. So we have the surface expanding. Now you need to be careful because this might start doing some odd shape. I don't need that much detail there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete pretty much all these here, delete them all, and keep a simple shape because it's going to be a bit awkward. And we can move this along the spline if we want, and just make it a bit more of a softer transition. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my top view, hit 1, I'm going to select all these splines, and I'm just going to move them across like this. So it covers that surface, and we have here, and I'm going to do the same to the other side. Down like that, move these across, something along that. So now we kind of have this surface to work with. So if I go edit poly on top, we now have this surface, and then the road can be a separate surface because I want them to be 2 separate ones. Now that we have that, we have our main surface. We can call this f_surface_main, and we can delete the other one. And now we can start adding in the grass. So first things first, I want to create the spline I'm going to use for the road edge. So if I go to my geometry again, isolate this, do the exact same thing. I'm going to go to the border, Control A to select it all, and then I'm going to create another shape, and I'm going to call this spline underscore road edge, and click OK. So then we have this spline. We need to move into our splines layer. We're going to isolate it, and then we're going to create our first project. So click here, click this, and right click and go up here, and let's name this. So this is going to be our rough edge along the edge. So let's go grass rough. Okay. And then we're going to go to geometry and add in the grass we're going to use, which is this common grass 01 large. Hit load selected and click all the messages. Once that's loaded in, you'll see it doesn't follow the spline. So what I need to do is I need to go to my surfaces and add in that surface we just created. So in here, perfect. We also want to move this new object into the forest objects. And you can see now we have something going on here, but what is it exactly? The first thing I want to do is I want to delete these segments here and here, because I want it to go just along the edge, like so. Go back to our grass rough. And what we need to do is go to our areas and then change this thickness. So we can slide this up and down based on those splines. So let's hit this and let's look at our scene. So that's about 1 meter, I'd say would be enough. We can keep going all the way as much as we want because we've got to be put stuff on top of it. So let's go about 1.5. I think would be plenty. Yeah, that'd be plenty of grass to be used. Now that we have that, we can hit render with our road and see what it looks like. So once we hit render, this is what we have. So it's coming along. We have our grass edge, we have our road, we have our grass edge here, and it goes along this way. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to add in the planting in the foreground here, and then maybe we'll add in a rail clone fence just as a template for the moment. So just one thing I've added in a rail clone fence just in here, and I've done the exact same techniques as which I've selected this, I've duplicated it and just used outline to create a spline on the outside of the road, and as simple as that. Now, one thing to remember from the image is that if I hide everything now, you'll see that at this point, it's not this rough texture anymore. It's not this texture at this point. It's something else. And also we need to add in different grass here that's nicely cut. So the very first thing is we're going to change the texture, and then we're going to add in the Forest Pro planting. So let's go into polygon mode in our object and let's select everything we think we need. And going here, we need to select a bit more. Keep going until we're happy. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but I think around here is where we see the transition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit detach, and that's fine. I'm going to call this G for geometry underscore road clean, we'll call it, and click OK. Now we don't want this material obviously on it, so what I'm going to do is in the V-Ray material library, I'm going to go to concrete, and we're just going to add in, yeah, we'll go for this one here. I'm not going to use triplanar because I want to keep the same mapping, and I'm going to click and drag this onto that. Now the great thing is, with the spline we've already created, we can duplicate this Forest Pro object and we can get this edge here. So if I duplicate this, and instead of rough we have cut, and click OK. Now all we need to do is change the different planting. So instead of the rough edge, we want to go to something that's cut. So go to geometry, back to library, and we're going to choose cut grass field 03 large, click. And once you're happy with that, we have one change we have to do, which is we need the spline that's in the center of this road. So now that we have that added in, that grass cut, we need to change a few things. So I have a few splines created. So these are the exclude splines. So if I add in this spline here, and then I change this to an exclude, you'll see it only goes as far as that point. Now we're going to change the thickness a lot here. So if I go to my spline here, my road edge, I don't want this to be 1.5 as thick. I only want it to be about 0.25. I want it to be just along the edge. And then if I go to my splines, I also need one down the middle. So I also need this spline here. So I need to add this in, add that spline in, And again, bring this down because it needs to be under the exclude. Then we also need to change this, not 10 meters, again the same 0.25. And we also need to add in a proper surface because at the moment we haven't added in the surfaces. So in surface we just have the main one which doesn't have the road, so we need to add in rough road and we need to add in the clean one as well. So now we have it down the middle. Now if I was to hit render now, you'll see it's doing the job, but it's a bit rough around the edges. And that's not what we want. In the image it's very clean. So there's a simple button we can just switch on. So click here, go to our road edge here and make sure it's on edge. And the same with our base road, make sure this is on edge. Then if we hit render, you'll see we now have that smooth, crisp edge. Now at the moment that's too little on the terms of the grass, so we need to make that a bit thicker. And we need to change the thickness of these. So let's go something like 0.4 and road edge will do 0.35. I want it to be a bit less. And yeah, that looks a bit stronger and it looks closer to what we want. So we've pretty much got the road done. We have the road texture here. We have it transitioning into a nice smooth landscape grass. And we have fencing, which probably will change, but I'm not too pushed. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add planting onto the edge. And it's really a rinse and repeat of what we've done with the grass, so it's not going to be too complicated. And then after that, we'll add in these 2 trees and we'll deal with this foliage here. Okay, now let's create the planting that goes around the edge. I've created this spline, just duplicating the spline I used for the rail clone and pushing it in. So I'm going to copy this grass that we have. We'll duplicate it and we're going to call it planting edge. Click OK. And we're going to remove all the splines here. So let's go to geometry and let's add in a few planting. And the ones I'm going to add in are, I think this and this should do for the moment. And we can go into distribution and we can change this to path and add this in just as a path and click here. Okay, obviously that's way too much, spacing is way down. So let's bring this up to every meter. Okay, and then we can do random position and just scroll this up and down until we get something we like. And I'm going to change the display to point clouds. So that's what it looks like. Go into our camera and let's see what it looks like in render. Okay, pretty good. A decent height. It's not over enveloping it too much. It goes along. Like we're missing a bit of edge here, but again, that's going to be filled in by this foliage. But overall, I'm happy with how that looks. And I only want it on this side. I don't want it on the other side. So that's perfect. Now we're going to add in the 2 larger trees we see here. Okay, so let's create a spline. I'm just going to click a random spot here and here. And we're going to slowly move it into position. So I think this one's pretty much okay. It doesn't worry about the height because the surface is going to determine that. And this one I think needs to be a lot closer. So it's pretty much around this mark. And we don't have to be too accurate because we can always change it later. We'll call it trees foreground. Okay. Oh, I need to change that. Okay. And then we need to add in these. So I'm going to go Forest Pro. I'm going to click this spline, go into modify, and let's add in 2 trees that we want. So I found 2 trees that I like. I'm going to click this and hit load selected. So when they're loaded in, obviously they're not the way I want. So what we want to do is we want to go to distribution, change this to path, add this path in, and then change this to in vertex position. Now there's a bit of an issue here. So if I'm pretty sure I know what's going on. If I go to that spline that we're using, so fix that error. Turns out when I unchecked interpolation, that was still there. So make sure you have this optimized checked and then we'll have that problem solved. So I'm going to go back to my Forest Pro object and I'm going to go to geometry and I'm going to, go to display and change this to point clouds. So now we can see it. And now let's see what position we're looking at. So another thing we also need to change is the surfaces. We need to add in the main surface that we use. So here we go, main surface, and they'll stick to the ground now. So as you can see, this one seems a bit too close. So let's grab this, hit 1, go to vertex mode, and then start moving this into a position that makes a bit more sense. So moving it here, let's go to the top view, and then start moving this to a position that roughly matches this. Doesn't have to be exact. And let's hit render and see what it looks like. And there you go. Now we have our tree. We have a tree here. Maybe it's a bit too big. It's taking up a lot of space, but happy out. So the next thing we need to do is in this space here, we want to add in this foliage. And before we do that, the main thing I want to do is I want to hone in on these surfaces that we're going to be using. So I'm going to add in the surface properly in here, and then all the surfaces behind, and then it's a simple case of filling in some rocks, boulders, and more trees in the background, and we should be done this course. Okay, so now I'm going to use a application called ZBrush to create the landscape. It might seem excessive, but I just find it a bit easier and quicker than using the tools in Max. So I'm going to go import and import what I have, which is this surface. Click OK, and we have it imported. Drag it on, hit T, and then we have our surface here. Now, if I go into my subtool, and don't worry if you don't know about ZBrush too much, it's not really needed. I'm just going to show how to create a surface and then export it straight back into 3ds Max. So I'm going to move this, which is one of the parts of my road, down. Down here. Why isn't it letting me move it down? I haven't used this in ages, by the way, so hopefully I'm not too sluggish at it. And merge down. That's fine. And then we have the road and this surface separate. Now, if I hit Shift F, you'll see the topology. It's not great, but ZBrush is great and powerful for this type of stuff. I can go to ZRemesher, remesh it, and there you go. Straight away, we have a much better surface to work with. And then if I go into this, I can hit divide a bunch, and we get, if I hit Shift F and Shift F again, we get more density packed thing. Now, I don't mind this going away from the edge, but I'm going to undo. And what we can do is in divide, I'm going to uncheck smooth, divide it once, twice, hit Shift F, and then put smooth back on and hit smooth. So then we have a lot more topology to work with, and we can start sculpting. I'm not going to do anything amazing. I'm just doing some simple stuff, and I'm going to grab my pen, which if you do have it, use a pen. I have a tablet here, and it's going to be a bit awkward because I have the webcam set up here, and if I start tilting the thing, it'll be all a mess. So excuse me if this doesn't look amazing. So over here is where we have the foliage that we're going to be concentrating on. But I'm just going to grab something that will give us a nice shape, like clay buildup is usually a good one. And I can just start drawing on here, and I can just create just some type of geometry. I don't want to go too high, but I also want to make sure I have some type of detail. And the one thing I will say is I haven't used this in a while, and I've already made one big mistake, which is I probably shouldn't be sculpting on that high resolution. So let's start on low resolution, like even 1. Maybe let's go 2. And then we can start sculpting little detail here and there. And again, I don't want anything, or I want to look organic. So it doesn't really matter what looks right or wrong, because nature is kind of all over the place. So let's just create something that isn't flat. So again, I'm just going to do bold shapes, and I'm just going to create something that gives our surface a bit of life, and that's really it. And I'm just going to start sculpting like this, smooth it out where needed. And the lower res you are, the stronger sculpting to smooth will have. So I'm going to cut back to when I have something that I like, and then we're going to bring it back into 3ds Max. So I've done a bit of sculpting, nothing amazing, but you can see it's not just some flat surface. It has a bit of life to it. It has a bit of geometry being extruded up and down and here and there. And now what I'm going to do is, we can't have this big huge high resolution mesh come into 3ds Max for something so simple. So what I'm going to do is I can bring this down to the lowest version, and I'm okay with that. So I'm going to delete the higher. And if I go in here, it'll tell me the high resolution. So we're at 4,775, which is absolutely fine. So that's the geometry I'm happy with. So I can go into here and go export. In our exports, I'm going to make this, we'll keep it in OVJ, it's fine, and go save. And let's import that into 3ds Max now. So this is our old surface, and let's import the new surface. So if I go File, Import, grab our new surface, which is this one, click Open, and you might get a few messages. I'm going to have these settings and click Import. So now that we have the new surface in, there's a few things we need to change. So with this spline on the rail clone, what I'm going to do is if I lift this up, you'll see it goes with it. But in Forest Pro, there's a great plugin you can install called Glue. I'm going to pick this surface and I'm going to say preserve vertex and I'm going to hit glue selected. And before I do that, I'm going to select here and go glue selected. And that's going to glue that spline to the surface. So then we just need to delete the old one, grab here, go into modify and just change the spline to the new spline. And then we have that fixed. If you want, you can rename this back to what it was and we're happy out. So that's what we've done for this surface. Now we just need to change all the surfaces for that Forest Pro object that we did before. So I'm going to do that now, hit render and see what we have to do next. So we're almost done with the foreground elements. As you can see, we have this new surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in our final planting, which will cover up all this, and then all that we'll have left are the foreground elements. So let's jump straight into that. So we're going to click on the new surface we made. Right click, go into modify, name this f_, we'll call Foliage, I'm going to call, and not the correct name really, but it'll do for now. And I'm going to start adding in plants which I think will work best with the scene. So I've added in a few planting. If I go to display and change this to point cloud, you'll see it a bit better. Now this is way too sparse. And it looked like a desert. So when you hit render, I've added soil in. It looks, nothing like you want. It looks like a desert and like nothing really grows here too well. But we want to change that. So how do we do that? We go into distribution, and the first thing we can do is we can change this to full, and straight away we get that kind of dynamic look and we get a bit more distribution. I'm also going to go to transform and switch on these straight away. Enable, enable, and enable. Now I think I want a bit more variation in the min and max, so 80 and 150 is good, rotation's good, and translation's okay. Now if I hit render on this, let's see if it looks any better. So yeah, looking a lot stronger and a lot better. Let's see what it looks like when it's all combined. We might have to then remove some of the foreground elements that seem to be attacking our cameraman. So the very first look, it looks extremely wild, a bit too wild for what we like. It's encompassing the fence as well, which we don't want, and in here it's a bit too dense, maybe even a bit too large. Maybe that 150 I did is too much. So let's start changing some settings, but before we change those settings, I'm going to remove objects from this edge, and I'm going to show you how to do that with Paint Tool. So go into the top view, select your Forest Pro object, and we're going to go into our areas tab, and we're going to add in a paint layer. So that's going to load up here, and we're going to change this instead of 20 meters. Let's change it to something like 5 meters. Click our paint tool and make this an exclude. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start painting where we don't want this. So again, that actually looks a bit too much. Let's go 2 meters. And just to show you how it looks, we're just going to start painting in here, and we're going to start removing where we don't want it. And that's along this boundary, this fence boundary. That's fine, and obviously we don't want it along here. Zoom in. It's a bit difficult to see so with all the colors, but hopefully that's making a bit of sense to you all. Like there. Drag it in here. Like this, and again I'm going to remove it all from the back over here because it's where our camera is and I just don't want it in the way. You can probably go a bit here as well. Let's remove it up here, and I think that should do for now. Let's see what it looks like. So immediately that looks a lot better. Again, I'm going to fix the height now, and we also then going to use the same paint tools to paint this grass into this little gap we see here. So first of all, let's change the height of these, and we're going to bring this back down to 120. Shows that I too know better than I do. So then we want to select this, and we want to go to areas, and we want to add in a paint layer. Go to make sure it's include, paintbrush, and we're going to start painting in where we want it, which is along here. Maybe 2 meters is a bit too much. Let's go 1 meter, and we're just going to start painting in that little gap. And we won't see up here, so I could stop here. And let's see if those settings have made things look a little bit better. And yeah, I think that's really coming along. In the end, we'll be changing colors in here. You see, like the forest, the I2 grass I always find is a bit too strong in saturation and green, but we can change that in these settings, and we can also change it in Photoshop. Same with the color in here and the lighting. So the main things we need to add now is the background, foreground elements. So I'm going to do the same thing, but I won't be showing the process. I'm going to be creating the surfaces in ZBrush. Since I've already did it, there's no point you seeing it over and over. So we'll jump back to when I have these landscapes built in the background. If you look here, it looks like our image, if I was to switch everything off, you see our path is now really off. And what I've realized now is the shot, the original shot taken, if I go to my camera settings, I had this at 40 mil. So if I did 40 again, you'll see it matches. But I realized that an outdoor shot like this probably was taken with a 24 mil lens, and that's why things look a bit different. So if I was to go into my geometry and if I hit render with the 40 mil, so you can see with the 40 mil, see how far away this little section is here compared to this. Like this looks very close to us, but it's the same distance like that we have here. But what's going on? It's basically the lens I'm using. So if I was to switch this now, if I was to select the camera and I was to switch this to more likely what the lens was, which is probably a 24 mil, you're going to see something very different. So now with that 24 mil lens, you can see that the distance here is more like the distance here. Maybe it's not as far, but it's looking a lot better. Now, I'm not going to go on and change all the trees to here and here. It's still the same shot. And again, we only use it for artistic purposes to get some type of an idea. So I'm going to move on now to how I created the background, render it out, and then bring it to Photoshop for some final edits and save it out. And that'll be the end of this course. So one of the very last things I have to do in 3ds Max is I just need to apply some trees to these backgrounds I've created. They're just basically a spline. Then I've added a poly, turbo, smooth, bit of noise, and then another smooth on top to make it a bit smoother. And they're quite large. Like you can see, this is our scene down here, and then these are just the background ones. So I've created this background, and I've plugged in the tree and just added the text, added the trees onto the surfaces. So this is the render we have. I'll switch off the noiser because it's having not the effects I want. And overall, this is what we've gotten after adding a bunch of planting, a texture onto this road, and just using that image for a bit of inspiration. Now you can make it any way you want, but this is what I'm going to settle with. And we might add stuff in the background in Photoshop. We'll see how we get on. But now I'm just going to render it out, bring it to Photoshop, and do some final adjustments. Okay, I realize this video is going on quite long, so I just wanted to roughly go over what I did. So I've done what most people probably know at this stage is I've gone to scripts and gone to load files at the stack, which loads in all my render elements into one file, and I have all these to work with. So I started off with this image. As you can see, it's very green and blue. So then I added in an AO, which is the ambient occlusion, and I just put this down to multiply in about 10%. And then I added in my perspective fog, which adds in, if I zoom in here, you can see it adds in this kind of mist. And how did I do that? Well, I made a selection using my IDs up here, which allowed me just white's visible, black's not visible. And in here, I have my fog set to a low opacity and soft light. And if I bring everything back, you'll see this just adds in that bit of like whiteness that hits it, that bit of fog. And then this is just basically I sampled the color of the sky, and again using this Z depth that loads of people know about and you can create, which creates depths. If I go into this, it creates that kind of depth feeling that gives that fog effect. Now let me bring this back, and that's pretty much the fog added in that gives that bit believability. I then merged that together, and then I created what's called a high pass, which basically if I zoom into something, it gives you that extra bit of crispness. So if I highlight that, you can see we get a bit more of a strong look about it. I'll zoom in here and we get again a stronger look and it looks sharper. Then I went in here and merged it, and then I added in a color lookup by going into adjustments and going down here to color lookup, and I added in a false color into it. And once I click that, we get that color adjustment that looks pretty good. Now, excuse me, Photoshop is having a bit of an issue. Oh, Photoshop loves to do this. See how this is highlighted? Just select here, and then I'll be able to zoom in and out again. So that's added in, and then all I did was add a vignette. And it's as simple as that. I don't like to overwork my renders. I like to do it simple just to get a scene out. And I hope this video was useful. I'm hoping to do shorter videos that focus on more minute things that people would like to see. So if you have any suggestions for anything you want to see, leave it in the comments and let me know. Thanks for watching.